Hello and welcome back to the County Chat channel. Today we're going to be talking about a bit more of England going forward with their cricket team. There's been some big news announced in the sort of last week of England cricket whilst the ODI series in Sri Lanka has been going on. Is Luke Wright is stepping down as the chief national selector for the England cricket team. It was kind of what I proposed it, and I think a lot of people talking about cricket and the England cricket team said someone had to go following this sort of England cricket series down in Australia in the Ashes after the sort of decimation that happened down under. And there has only been one head to roll so far. It sort of seems like that might be the only head that will roll. Yeah, Luke Wright. From my home county, he's a Sussex boy and one of our best sort of exports in the sort of modern game. But yeah, he's been the national selector sort of since Key and McCullum and Stokes have been in charge. And yeah, he's gone. He's stepped down. I think there was a sort of partly family reason given, but I think if I was being honest and I was looking at just from an outside perspective, I think it seems that it's a kind of we need to get rid of someone who can go. It seems like the most expendable sort of person in that kind of four-man think tank, if you will. But it's quite an interesting one. And I think someone had to go. I think as I think Jonathan Agnew was the kind of biggest person and the main proponent. Is they had to go at that point. Something had to change in the essence of what was going on for England cricket. But anyway, it's sort of he'll be going straight after the 2026 World Cup, which is sort of being built up to at the moment, the white ball stuff. But I think it's kind of already pretty much gone because at the end of the day, when you're the head selector, if you've already done the selecting of the squad, you going after the World Cup's kind of irrelevant in some sort of a way. So he is kind of gone, and Rob Key has kind of already said his goodbyes, and he sort of was quoted as saying, "I've absolutely loved working with Luke. His contribution to England cricket has been exceptional, and I trust his judgment as much as anyone. He has added so much more to his role than being England selector. I'm very sad to see him go and wish him and his family the best for the future, and I have no doubt that at some stage down the road, he will enhance English cricket once again." So that was a sort of brief statement that ECB's managing director, Rob Key, gave. But to me, this feels like a massive juncture for England's sort of Bazball era. To again, keep using Bazball. I always use it, and I sort of hate myself for using it because it's just a bit of an arbitrary term. But it's short, it's sweet, it's easier than the McCullum Stokes Key era, saying that over and over again. Anyway, but to me, it feels like a really big moment. Will this show a change in selection, or will this be sort of another person to just be a bit of an echo chamber within the kind of how they view cricket, how this aggressive view of Test cricket, entertainers rather than winners, all of this sort of stuff. So it's an interesting one to me. I hope it will be sort of they'll have a change in emphasis in their selection. So their sort of selection policy will be helped and put into with a kind of more of a pragmatic selection policy, and then you can kind of mold those cricketers into the kind of Bazball cricketers that you want them to be. So to me, I saw it suggested just after the Ashes was done. I can't actually remember who wrote the article saying it, but I think an Australian ex-cricketer said that Alistair Cook should be put as someone to be the sort of yin to the yang of Brendan McCullum, which was quite interesting. I think that was put on the Stick to Cricket podcast, and he was asked about it, and he was kind of like, to be honest, I'd never thought about it, but then as soon as it's said by someone, you kind of start thinking about it. But I think that could be interesting. But if he's not going to be a coach, I don't know if Alistair Cook maybe seems as the most natural coach. Does it make sense him being a chief selector? I don't know. This was just somewhere my mind went straight away. So imagine, Alistair Cook as a chief selector. He has a more of an old school view of it. Runs, production, wickets, all of these things are more important, and not necessarily just how you score them, but just if you score them, say. But then him kind of being the sort of, again, the yin to the yang of this kind of aggressive mindset towards cricket. And I think that could be a sort of quite a compelling forward place for the ECB to go from. So players, I don't know, say like Hameed, Dom Sibley, Josh Bohannon, I think I wrote down, Sam Cook, Jamie Porter, Ollie Robinson, players who've, for an extended period, I mean, Josh Bohannon's had a few bad seasons recently, but over extended period of time have done very well in England's first class system, whether or not that they could start being put forward into the England sort of fray. It's an interesting thought to have. I think whoever sort of falls into this role, I hope falls into that yin to the yang. I'm going to keep using that phrase, yin to the yang of the sort of Key McCullum Stokes axis, because at the end of the day, they all see cricket in a very similar way. Excuse me. But that has been a very compelling part of them as a three, and they've changed the way England play cricket and have been a big change in the mindset and all of the things around cricket. But that doesn't mean that the person who comes in to be the selector has to be the exact same. And in many ways, I think a lot of the suggestions from a lot of the people who are, ex-England players on the TV has been exactly that. Like, you want someone who is that kind of, the yin to the yang, to keep using that phrase, and kind of they can mould players that these people select with a bit more of a respect for the county championship. And I think it also would mean that players in the county championship would again have that motivation, because over the last 4 years, it hasn't really mattered how you've done in the county championship. It's just been a case of, we'll pick you if we think you fit into these arbitrary sort of selection policy things that we have. And we kind of are a bit coy about actually saying what that is. The person who often has been tipped to replace Rob Key, and I'm pretty confident for a few sources of mine that he got actually offered the job of being director before Rob Key, is Alex Stewart. So he's been the director of cricket for a very long time, and then obviously got rid of the job, resigned from the job in the news of his sort of wife was passing away, and sort of spent more time with his family in that time. But to me, sort of following all of that and all of that sadness in his life, would he be a perfect person, similar to an Alistair Cook, that kind of more old school view? I mean, compared to Alistair Cook, obviously has a lot more experience being a kind of part of selection policies, part of building a successful team, because he was, the architect or the mind behind Surrey's dominant team of the last 3 to 4 years. I mean, they didn't win this year, but they won the 3 before that, and they were very, very close to winning this year. So again, for me, it's a sort of, he would be another mould of that kind of classical view of Test cricket and how you win Test matches. So then maybe his selection policy would then be moulded into where these, McCullum's, the Bazball think tank could kind of really talent progress these players, because I think that's been the great strength of Bazball. And again, very easy to forget with such a poor series having just happened, that there has been strength of Bazball, and how players have changed and how and adapted to the new thing has brought out another level to these cricketers. So going back to the Ashes series briefly, it must be dwelled upon correctly. As the first 2 test matches were really proved how England were so undercooked in their preparation, and as a whole, the Ashes, other than some brief respites in some great some bowling successes on particular wickets, or periods of Joe Root dominance and Bethell's Sydney century, aside from that, it was a general domination by the Australian team, and England were by far the second best team. That was always, change was always going to be afoot. Right, there was always going to be something had to go, and so far it is only the head selector who has gone. So I think, to me, it can't be understated how big of a moment this sort of next step is for this era of Bazball. If the ECB are totally backing and doubling down on Rob Key, Brendan McCullum, and Ben Stokes, but obviously Ben Stokes wasn't going anywhere, and Brendan McCullum had the White Ball World Cup. So if they're doubling down on Rob Key, let's be honest, it has to be that Rob Key is aware of the frailties and the issues that this England Test team has had. He has to look at the fact that over the last 4 years, Bazball has been incredibly effective in favourable home conditions, so on flat pitches, or in places like Pakistan, which also had incredibly flat pitches. But when they've gone against the 2 big nations in their home conditions, so when they went to India, they lost 4-1. When they went to Australia, they've lost 4-1. You have to see that this so obviously was second best in those 2 series. And to show that it's frail. It's not like it's necessarily this total one size fits all policy, and England are just reinventing Test cricket, and everyone just doesn't know how to play it properly. And look, let's see how we can do it, which has often been what it's come across to international cricket fans, but also to England cricket fans. There's this kind of arrogance, this like, we know best, and this is how we're going to do it, and we are just deifying you with the greatness of how Test cricket should be played, and England are going to play it. And everyone's felt kind of like patronised and a bit like, well, Test cricket's been played for hundreds of years, and we know that it's not as simple as that. And England have done very well on really flat pitches, and have done really well. I mean, the only place you'd have to say that an away series, which was uber impressive, was New Zealand, right? Because other than Australia, teams don't tend to win Test series in New Zealand, and they won away, and that's really impressive. But again, it does quite practically suit what has become a sort of English Kiwi vibe to this Test team. That, funnily enough, the tactics that Brendan McCullum has grown up with, even Ben Stokes, you could argue, their tactics to try and win and how you play on those pitches worked in New Zealand as well. So being aggressive on real green seamers on day one, and then being willing to chase on flatter pitches as the sort of grass fades on those New Zealand pitches, is exactly what Bazball's always been about. And that was the kind of mould of what they tried to do at Perth, right? and it just didn't quite work out. So to me, I think that this kind of how they've only won in places where it suit them shows how fragile it is for this team. If you're trying to win everywhere, you're trying to get to World Test Championship finals, you can't just have a kind of one size fits all policy and a sort of way of winning, a way of playing, which only wins you test matches in certain places. And that, if England have to be totally honest, that has been the case for this test match team, right? So to me, I think if the team is going to go forward and just continue with we're entertainers and maybe more than we are winners, which has kind of always been sort of battered away whenever a sort of journalist has asked any of the sort of, the heads of, Stokes, McCullum or Keane and gone, is this kind of the way you look at cricket now? And they go, no, don't be silly. We're massively competitive. Obviously, we all care about winning. And it's so easy, of course, we all believe that. They're elite athletes. But to me, if you just keep doing the same thing over and over again, expect a different result, it's a definition of insanity, right? So to me, that's why I think this moment of whoever they appoint in that future head selector role is such a big one, because it has to be a change in view. It has to be a change in mindset to me. Otherwise, you're just accepting, you're happy with being, I don't know where we are in the World Test Championships standings, but probably, I don't know, 6th, 7th or 8th. And you're saying as England test team, you're happy with that. I don't think that's with the money behind it, with the talent we have and the kind of backing generally we have. That should be where England are aiming for. And I don't think that is where anyone would sort of claim they're aiming for. So I think it's a real interesting one. So to me, like, for example, Brendan McCullum's greatest success as a test match coach for England, right, has been the bringing of Joe Root from that level of like, he's one of the greatest England players to being one of the greatest ever players, right? His production in the Bazball era is maybe the thing which you could hold on to for Brendan McCullum more than anything. But what does Joe Root fall into? He's probably the least Bazball batter of the batting lineup, right? I mean, you could talk about Harry Brook, and of course he's come in and been a sort of generational talent, but been super frustrating at points. So in many ways, like Jonathan Agnew suggests, it helped him to begin with, but is it going to help him keep going? Whereas Joe Root kind of was already at this elite level, and then this sort of freeing mindset, this more tactical mindset rather than a technical mindset, has been such a big part of Bazball, or not big part of Bazball, but such a big part of, Brendan McCullum's success. And I think a lot of people have said Joe Root's batting is kind of propped up Bazball. And I think that's a really fair thing to say. But to me, what this proves is that Brendan McCullum is a great man manager. He's a very good, he can really understand what players need to make them feel more comfortable. And I think he's been able to really mould players into this sort of these high performing athletes as they already are. They're all professional cricketers. They've all made it to the England team. And, he's been able to sort of make them, mould them into the way he views cricket, but in a way that they feel comfortable playing their own cricket. And I'm not maybe explaining this well, but I think that's been his greatest skill and attribute as a coach. He's sort of been able to mould them into this vision of Test cricket, but whilst keeping them themselves. And to me, that's what the sort of next challenge of Bazball will be, is these players who maybe weren't the most natural selection picks for England in the future. So, for example, I think Zach Crawley's position as a test match opener is untenable for me. I cannot understand how we can just keep saying he's going to get better when there's been over 60 test matches of proof that he averages 30 as a test match opener. And if he doesn't go back to first class cricket and dominate, and I don't care what I'm told that, you scoring runs at domestic cricket doesn't matter. It does. Any cricketer will tell you that. And it puts you in a stead that that in any situation, it's problem solving, right? If you stick Joe Root in a Yorkshire jersey for a whole season, he'll score 1,000 runs because he knows how to problem solve. So don't tell me that batting at test match level is just so deifiedly different to first class cricket because of the bowlers you face. Of course it is different. No one's claiming it isn't. But anyway, without getting lost in a sort of first-class rant that I have been on the brink of for the last 6 months, say, but to me, I think this is the challenge of where they go with his selective role, is that if they can bring in players who are these kind of old-school players, right, and not an old school in any kind of bad way, but old school in the sense of they value their wicket, they try and play cricket the right way. So to me, the most obvious one is Zach Crawley out and Hameed in. So Hameed has just come off the 2 of his best years as a cricketer. He's already played test match cricketer as a sort of 21-year-old. But his ability to sort of build up runs, he was the captain of this Nottinghamshire side, which just toppled this great Surrey side that I was referring to earlier, and he's become a run machine in recent years. But he's also technically excellent, which is something that Zach Crawley is so clearly not, right? Excuse me. So to me, someone like him would be a perfect example of Bazball being married into a kind of sustainable view of cricket for England, right? He's become a more aggressive batter as he's got basically better and he's been able to dominate lineups better and bowling lineups better and been more technical. But his average has just creeped closer and closer to 40 over the last few years, which as an opener in first-class red ball cricket is quite an impressive thing. He's also, I think he's 29. He's kind of like, for batters, that tends to be your sort of golden age. I think a lot of people are that late 20s, early 30s. You're still physically really right. You're still seeing the ball really well, but your technique is kind of as pristine as it ever would be. But to me, he would be someone who never would have been picked in the last 4 years, right? Because he has a very old school kind of approach. He's a bit more see off the new ball, attack the change bowlers, go at a strike rate around 50 or less. But if they can start bringing in players like him and moulding them into the sort of Bazball mould of being slightly more aggressive, maybe more proactive, more tactical, all of those things, I think to me, someone like Brendan McCullum could do that, could bring the best out of Haseeb Hameed, or whomever it might be, and even a Dom Sibley. I mean, he's the kind of stereotypical anti-Bazball player, but again, scored the most runs in Division 1 last year, scored some of the most runs in Division 1 the year before that. But to me, Haseeb Hameed is the one, if I was asked specifically, because he has that ability to really change gears and go forward. And he would never have been picked in the previous iteration of the management. But if we have a sort of selector who's a bit more old-fashioned, looks at the run scoring charts over the last 3 years, Haseeb Hameed would be the obvious answer to the top order problems to me. And also, as much as no one wants to admit it, Ben Stokes is an ageing all-rounder. He's 34, about to turn 35. He's played 120 test matches, roughly. His career as captain is going to be getting nearer to the end. So you have to start looking at who's going to be the next captain. And to me right now, in the next 2 years, say Stokes retired, Harry Brook to me is not ready to be an all-format captain for all of England. And I think his antics off the field have really proved that. And that is fine. And that is okay. I'm not saying he should be stripped of all leadership responsibilities in the future, which has been a big thing I've been getting leveled at me since my Steve Smith comments. But I think for right now, he's maybe not ready to be that total, the head of the England cricket team and everyone sort of falls in behind him. I think he's got a great cricket brain. I do think he's maybe overratedly a bit of a dozy idiot sometimes. I don't think he is as much. I think he's just young and he sort of lives life and he's a bit mental. But I think for right now, being the Test match captain would be a step too far. Just in the same way that I think if Ben Stokes had got this Test match captaincy as a 27, 28-year-old, it would have been a step too far for him as well. So this is not me saying Harry Brook could never be Test match captain. But what I'm sort of leading towards, and I'm sure people are probably realising, me talking about Haseeb Hameed, he's just captain Nottinghamshire to the county championship win against a very, very well-backed, well-run Surrey team and against some very other good county championship teams. It was a very good year of county championship cricket, and he was the captain of that and the leading run scorer of that. So to me, if he could be a captain for England for 2 years, having already had 2 years of experience while Stokes was still captain, he would become a more tenable leadership idea. Whereas I think what England have consistently had with captains over the years is that it kind of is like, oh, well, I guess it has to be Joe Root. Or I guess it has to be Ben Stokes. And obviously Ben Stokes has worked out. But I don't want it to get to a point in 2 years' time where we go, oh, well, it has to be Harry Brook because he's our best player and he's already the white ball captain, but we've got no one else because everyone else is either too bad or like they're not a leader or whatever. Because Zach Crawley's been, often held up as a potential leadership candidate. But if you're averaging 30 as a Test match opener, how are you keeping you around? And I think it's tough to be that harsh on someone like Zach Crawley. I think he comes across like an incredibly good guy and seemingly a good tourist, which is obviously a big part of being a Bazball player. But someone like Haseeb Hameed would be a massive, massive change in the Bazball view. And it would also be a change in showing that you can be aware of your difficulties or your limitations as a Test match 11, but also being aware that you can fix them. And then someone like Haseeb Hameed could become a slightly more aggressive opener and become a more proactive sort of player. But if you just sort of basically only select players who fit into your vision of Test cricket and you only select players who are already there at that vision of Test cricket, rather than trying to mould players like you did someone like Joe Root into then being one of the best Test match batters we've ever seen. Joe Root over the last 2-3 years is really on that level of kind of eras of dominance that are sort of unseen before, of like what he's been averaging, the numbers he's been putting up. of course, even and shown by the fact that his tour of Australia, where he got two quite big hundreds, was well below his average, or not well below, but below his average for the last few years by quite a long way. But that's a 5 Test match series with 200 scores in it. To me, this is where I'm getting lost in these various strands of this argument. But I think to me, that's why this head selector role is such an important moment, because I think it has to sort of show willing to be wrong and be like, we got it slightly wrong, and this is the way we're going to change it. And don't get me wrong, like in Luke Wright's head selector role, he's also been ahead. He's been brought in Josh Tongue. He's brought in a few other very good international bowlers who've been international players, and Harry Brook, of course, being the most obvious. And then not the most obvious, because the most obvious is, of course, Jacob Bethell. So I think, it's easy to say all the things I've just said about first-class cricket and how Bazball have kind of turned their back on it, but you also have to appreciate the side of Bazball that has worked. And someone like Jacob Bethell is a perfect example. They talent identified Jacob Bethell from a young age and was like, this is a future England player. He hadn't played that much domestic cricket. Warwickshire weren't putting him in his team. And, sort of were on and off putting him in the team. And then before you know it, Jacob Bethell's picked for every England team. He plays well in that New Zealand tour and all of these things. And everyone was crying foul of, how, if Ollie Pope fails, have we only got this kid who's never scored a first-class 100? What does he go and do? He scores 100 at Sydney for his first-class 100, and it was one of the best innings I've ever watched sort of start to finish. I was lucky enough that I was waiting in an airport on the way home from Australia at the time, and I watched almost all of it on a phone. And it was a brilliant innings against some very good bowling on a sort of, not a challenging surface, like it was a pretty flat pitch, but again, such a good bowling lineup that no matter the run, how you score the runs. But again, how did he do it? He did it at a strike rate around 55. He was positive when he needed to. Excuse me. But he was able to be behind an incredibly strong defence, right? So you have to appreciate the two levels of the talent identification. You have to give the flowers to someone like Luke Wright and all the people who were around when they were like, yeah, Jacob Bethell's the truth. This is a guy we need to have in our lineup. But you also have to appreciate that it hasn't worked on another level of it, and you have to sort of marry the two together. And don't get me wrong, like that is not an easy thing to do, and that is kind of the whole basis. But to me, and I've come to been attacked by a lot of Aussie fans recently, but I think that is what Australian cricket does so well. They pick out players from a young age and go, you're the best player we've ever seen. You're in our team, but to be fair, they give them the chance in first-class cricket before. But, people like Cam Green, Ricky Ponting years ago, all these players who got picked at a very young age, Michael Clarke, obviously a very famous one, Pat Cummins, another very famous one, players who they just earmarked as like, you will be a successful Test cricketer if we mould you correctly. But then Australia are also willing at the other side of it to pick the 32-year-old, 33-year-old who is at the peak of their powers to be incredibly good for 2-3 tests. So Michael Neser, Scott Boland, that was the idea with him 3 years ago, and then 4 years ago even, and then he stayed around for that whole Test Ashes cycle, has come back and been one of their best bowlers. This series just gone. So you have to be a perfect Test match sort of setup. To me, that's where you have to be able to fall between. You have to be able to identify young players who are going to be excellent and look at first-class cricket and see your players who would just produce year in, year out. And I think England got too far to one side of it, and they would only pick players who they thought was that talent. But you have to have a somewhere in between, right? So I think it's a very like difficult decision, and of course Rob Key, I'm sure, was taking a lot of time, and all the other heads. I think it's someone like Richard Gould, is that his name? All these people, I'm sure, taking the chief selector role incredibly seriously on who they put into it next. But to me, you have to have a kind of marrying of those two sides of it, like Australia does with someone like George Bailey, and like a lot of teams do, like India, again, like all of these places in South Africa, all these places have successful Test match sides, New Zealand, all of them have to have that ability to pick out young players like Rachin Ravindra for New Zealand, but also have players like Jacob Duffy, who all of a sudden we're seeing Jacob Duffy start taking polls, and they went, yeah, we'll have you in, and then he's done brilliantly this summer for New Zealand. So you have to have that as a successful sort of Test match team. And to me, that's been the major limitation of England in the last 2 or 3 years. They got too stuck on the sort of like potential overproduction. And I think that can be a really difficult place to get out from. And again, I mentioned it earlier, but I think the reason Haseeb Hameed to me is such a perfect illustrative example, I think, is because of that. he's not the typical player who'd come in. He's maybe not the most typical personality who'd come into the team, and I think that's been a part of Bazball's selection policy more than some people would suggest it should be. And that should again be aware that like having people with different kind of backgrounds and different kind of views on things and different kind of, not views necessarily, but just sort of different, I don't know, perspectives, different kind of characters is again a really good thing. And that is kind of what cricket's all about. It's the weird characters that fill a dressing room, and everyone has their slightly different things. So a quieter, more reserved version of Hameed following Ben Stokes as a captain shouldn't be a bad thing, because he's not like Ben Stokes. He's not trying to be exactly like Ben Stokes, but he's just going to be who he is, and has been proven to be a very effective leader whilst being in Nottinghamshire, if that makes sense. But he's still got as good of a cricket brain. So I think that's just where I guess it comes into, and it's tactical flexibility, it's selection flexibility, and it's sort of mindset flexibility. And I guess that's where England fans have found it frustrating, is because it's felt like there's been none of the above. It's felt like there's been a consistent, this is how we do it, this is the way we look at the world, and this is how we play it. And funnily enough, in certain situations, it just hasn't worked. So to me, in the next 2 or 3 years, and as much as I don't like to admit it, we have to start looking towards when Ben Stokes might retire as an all-rounder, because, Jacques Kallis is kind of on his own as a test match all-rounder who carried on to about 150 plus test matches. Everyone else who have that much workload on their body, which Ben Stokes has obviously shown with the injuries he's had, tend to start faltering around this age. And again, I had plenty of Aussies in my comment section telling me, his batting's really going down a hill if you go on the averages and the runs per year and all of those things you can look at. But of course, it's not nice to think about as an England fan, because at the end of the day, the Bazball era has been exciting because he's won so many test matches. His win percentage, despite those 2 big series losses, is still one of the highest as an England test match captain. So again, it's a worrisome one, and it's a weird thought to be putting yourself in. But England have to start widening their scope of players who can come in and be leaders, but also players who can come in and be excellent for 4 or 5 years. And they don't need to be a dominant force for the next 15 years, right? It's finding the players who are the best at that moment. So yeah, to me, I think a kind of an Alex Stewart and Alistair Cook as the 2 examples I gave as head selector candidates, and I have no idea. I haven't seen anything that suggested they are being shortlisted or they're interested in the role even. But to me, they were just sort of good illustrative examples, because they both have a kind of maybe more old-fashioned view of Test cricket. And I say old-fashioned, like Alistair Cook didn't retire in the last 10 or so years from first-class cricket. I mean, these players played fairly recently. It's within the realms of Test match cricket. It's still very modern that Alex Stewart and Alistair Cook both played. But I guess it's a more old-fashioned view of just how you select a team, how you look forward to the future, how you try and win Test matches at home. And maybe you don't work in Ashes cycles as aggressively as England always have, and that maybe you look at who's going to be the best for this summer, who's going to be the best for this tour here. And to me, that this is all in the stuff that has been the main falters of Bazball. So wherever it goes, wherever the selector is, and for all I know, like the decision's been made now, and I'm just speaking to a microphone for no accord, and there's no value in what I'm saying. But to me, I hope it just comes in, and it's not a selector who you just think, oh, that's another person who views the world exactly as McCullum, Key and Stokes do. It's a player who an ex-player who looks at the world. I don't even have to be an ex-player, in my opinion, that like views cricket, views stats, views how cricket players should be picked in a more evidence-based rather than narrative-based, or not narrative-based, but like these are the ways our cricketer should look like, or what he should sound like, and what he should play like. Pick players who just make score runs, take wickets, simple as that, and field well. Then you can mould them into whatever cricket you want them to be. And that is what I hope they do. I worry it won't be. I worry it will just be another voice into the echo chamber, and the same kind of players will keep getting picked, and nothing will change until a massive kind of regime change happens, which is very, very possible. But I think what I like to imagine about Rob Key, and I think what was clear about Rob Key since this series, is that he's been willing to admit when things haven't gone totally right. It's one thing to be willing to admit when things haven't gone totally right. It's just another thing to be open and honest enough and say, how do we change it? Because it's one thing to admit you're wrong. It's another thing to change it to make sure it doesn't happen again. And that's what I think is the big thing. To me, the sort of mission statement for their head selector should be able to marry that kind of talent identification versus the kind of production, and that is all. Again, I've ended up sort of giving a mission statement for what I think the England selector should be sort of saying in their interview or be proving to Rob Key, and I think it's Richard Gould. I could be just making that name up as well, by the way. And I hope, I mean, not that any of them are going to hear what I have to say, but I hope that this is the kind of frame of mind they're looking at it. Anyway, this has just been kind of one long narrative video with not many iterations off either way, but I hope you've enjoyed it. If you have and watched all the way this far, firstly, thank you. Make sure you subscribe, follow wherever you might be. There'll be plenty more content coming out. I've got a lot of plans for some new videos, so I hope you stick around for all of that. There should be some videos around my face if you want some more of my content. But thank you very much for watching. This has been the County Chat, and have a great day.